Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be back again on this platform. And please, for those who are coming to this channel for the first time, do check out my videos and let me know your feedback. And also, don't forget to subscribe. All right, coming to the first things first. It's been a long time since I did a live on this platform where I put out my thoughts on various issues. Why did I create this channel? I wanted to start talking or expressing myself in various ways. So this is one way, apart from many other ways which I usually do. So today I wanted to talk about something very interesting that I came across. So China is something that we're all now very against. We're all against China. China has to be kicked out of our territory. There's all this discussion going on whether we have a war with China or not. All these kind of topics are coming up. But if you look at China's history, its present status as a emerging global power, some say it's already a global power. So this status is coming out of a strong I would say, economic growth and a proper development policy. So before we get into the fine, nitty gritty of how China grew, I'll just mention that it is essential for any nation to have a strong economic policy so that it can use that economic growth as a catalyst for promoting itself in the global arena. So this is the main reason why I'm taking this up. So I was asked a couple of weeks ago to start analyzing on China, how China started its product, growth, etc. So this video is going to be all about that. So let's get straight into the topic. So I'm just sharing my screen. If you can see it. So yeah, this is. So let me start off. I think my screen is visible. So let me start it off. All right. So you have. Uh, so I'll title my presentation as why China had to stop looking inwards and start looking outwards. So there's one reason for that. Uh, First of all, if you look at it's simple. It was all about how the older system had failed in not just one but many times. So that essentially is all about how China has to started its growth. Why there's a lot of questions that come up. All right, so why China had to abandon Mao's system? So it was a very people did not understand how India had to abandon it because in India's case, what you had was a system that was already weak for at least 20 years. The whole Soviet system that you had was not very, encouraging because you had a lot of flaws at various levels. But this did not yield into create an opportunity for change only up till the 1991 crisis. So let's look at China. What does China have in Mao's time? Mao's cultural revolution, Great Leap Forward, all of these were aimed at ensuring that those in agriculture would try to prosper, create some incentives where there would be a lot of agricultural growth. Everybody was asked to shift from the urban areas to go to rural areas and work in rural areas. So all this kind of a program was created. But what happened because of that? All these centralized schemes and made sure that there was not much progress. So you had a fall in living standards, you had agrarian distress, and you had a lot of famine and all this kind of, I would say, uh, you know, what people would call a counter or a result of why there was a revolution problem. So let's come to the main point is there was a sharp fall in living standards. You had an agrarian distress and a famine. The most important impact I would say of the cultural revolution and all the Mao's great programs was that you had a serious famine in China which reduced its agricultural strength, and it was such that they had a consistently low productivity in all the other sectors and not just in agriculture. So, coming to the mm, situation then, how was the situation in agriculture? You had all the means of production were in the ownership of communes and production brigades and production teams. What was essentially a commune was a set of farmers put together from the lower level up to higher. The highest was a commune. So you had a group of farmers in the village. Take it that way. You had a group of farmers in the village. They would be a member of a commune, and that's how you would call it a farmers union in India. So this was a highly centralized, collective, and unified management system. So you had a central authority which was directing all this, and even the labor management was centralized. So you had no incentive to increase your output unless the government said so. So you had farm households which were not recognized as production units. There was just a group of farmers for them who till the land and then uh, produce the crop. So there was no business perspective to farming in agriculture. So this ensured that there was no enthusiasm left, and uh, there was no enthusiasm literally, and there was no sense of ownership amongst the farmers. So what would that result in? It was a clear-cut case of you are even though it appears that the land and everything is yours because it's community owned, you did not have an incentive to produce more because you were not allowed to produce more until the state said so. The state would fix the prices, the state would fix the quantity of production, and the state would also tell you where to sell. You had such a centralized system where everything was directed from above. There was no bottom up transformation. So what does this result in? One was the labor achievements of farmers were divergent from economic benefits. And also, you had rigid policies with respect to migration. So, you could not, if you wanted to shift from one province to the other, you could not do it so easily. So, this was one major flaw. And if you look at the other reasons, it is such that the low productivity contributed to a fall in other sectors, and this resulted in in a situation where you did not have any uh, product. There was already low productivity, so you had low market access. There was not enough incentives provided to the agricultural sector, so you had a serious problem in agriculture. How did this translate into the other sectors? So service sector was not much developed. So you had only the industrial sector. So in the industrial sector, the industrial base that China had was very low, and it was dependent on the blueprints of for the Soviet Union. It was asking all the high tech machineries, steel plants, all this technology you had was provided to them by the Soviet Union. But after a point, Soviet Union moved away from China and it pulled out all its experts, so to say, who were giving technical assistance to China. So China was left high and dry. What happened then? So under the communist rule, China maintained policies that kept the economy poor. It was centrally controlled and relatively isolated from the global economy. more, relatively, I would say I use the term relatively isolated because India was less isolated than China vis-a-vis this policy, because it was the whole idea was to have a self-reliant, autarkic economy without any scope for trade, because it was viewing them as the West as imperialist powers, while it did not engage in any trade with the other nation in the general sense. So this was a situation in China. Industries were primarily owned by the state, so public sector undertakings. So this graph, I would say, is basically showing what is the annual output in China's agricultural sector. If you notice the graph, the, the output added was almost stagnant up till mid 80s and almost 90s. If you take a look at it, that means, and the reforms, if you remember, was started in 1978 with the four modernization program by the Chinese premier Deng Xiaoping. From 1978, it took at least 1990 to 1995, almost 1995, to start showing an increase in agricultural value added. That means only after 93, or at least 15 to 20 years of program of reforms, only then did you see a outcome of such reforms. This is a similar graph which is showing a similar trend with respect to per capita income in China. So you had between 1980 to 1990. If you see the period before when the reforms were started, there was a slight increase, but then it was not substantial at least till mid 90s and early 2000s. This shows that reforms take time to be implemented. It's not just implementation, but how people take it up and how people uh, use the opportunity that reforms provide in their case. So I'll make a mention of a very important paper that was published by Subramanian Swamy. It noted that it was a retail price index measure. So how China measures its GDP and its calculations, etc. So this particular paper shows that there was a lot of overestimation in the calculations made. So one adjusted it, it showed that there was low productivity across the board. What added to this problem was a gross inefficiency in the use of capital and labor. So what you find is just more capital, more labor. There was no really a proper transformation in the industrial sector, even at the time of reforms. So the output mix was also inappropriate. So not everything got. It was not really a Pareto optimal, so to say. There was no Pareto optimal output level in production. So you had unnecessary production by the state in some goods. You did not have adequate production in other goods. So you had this problem because all this was called the planned output and the planned prices. Because as per a period of planning, they had to calculate what is the requirement, what is the prices, etc. Because this was a feature of the centrally planned economy. So what happened after this? The industries were also concentrated in few regions, which meant that a vast amount of population was left uncovered and thus remained in agricultural activities and allied activities in the communes. So this was a situation in China with respect to the industrial sector. So uh, the main problem with uh, China was that you did not have any adequate financing of industries. You had only a certain uh, means where you had almost 95% of the proceeds that the industries made went back to the state government. So the state government took back whatever money that the companies created. So in a way, it's called what you see now is called in terms of dividends. Almost everything was taken back by the state, leaving no scope for the firms to create adequate capital and build more industries or build more infrastructural projects. So it was a very limited setup. So Deng Xiaoping initiates reforms 1978-1980. So between these two intervening years, he created a systematic plan wherein he had a short-term plan and a long-term measures. So this is something similar to what we did in India in '91 under the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. So it was all about structural reforms, stabilization measures in India after IMF asked for it. Also, we had our domestic balance of payment crisis, and it provided an opportunity to transform it. So, Deng Xiaoping first focused on what is the immediate measures. So, the whole reforms that China implemented can be divided into two aspects. The one is the household and agricultural systems reform, and the other was the industrial recovery and urban sector. So, China opened up its markets and engaged in trade with the West. The reforms were initiated in the rural areas first. This is a very important point with respect to if you wanted to analyze between India and China, you'll find that we directly went at the time of independence itself, though the first 5 year plan focused on agriculture, the trust was laid on in heavy industry right after that in the second 5 year plan, and thereon it was only heavy industry. And therefore, we neglected agriculture and directly jumped ship over to the industrial sector. While China followed a planned policy, and even the reforms were a bit consistent. They focused because agriculture was almost there was a predominance in agriculture even in China. So you had a similar economic situation between India and China up till the 70s, and almost after that you had a divergence. If you take a look at uh, what China did, it focused first on agriculture, it reformed its agriculture, and then started, after a period, started reforming the industrial sector. So I would add to that that even this is a view accepted by many strategists and policymakers and observers that West enthusiasm was also a driving force in building ties with communist China as a bulwark against Russia or the USSR, Soviet Union as it was called. So, what was the reforms all about? How did he start reforming China? So, in agriculture, he introduced what is called as the household responsibility system. So what was this essentially? You ensured that the land was not left idle. You ensured that the community would provide the land for say 30, 20, 30 years for a group of farmers and their families to use the land productively and start growing crops on it and then enable them to sell it, not just in that market but other markets. So you had a lot of liberalized controls. All the controls were removed on at least 35 agricultural products. What did it happen? What did that ensure? Now that resulted in what is known as a price control reform. So earlier you had a planned price, you had a planned quota, you had a planned way of distributing products. But now this ensured that your entire price system now became two systems. So you had a price reform, planned reform or planned prices, I would say, planned output, and you had a non-planned output and non-planned price. That means a market price. So to an extent, if to an extent, or let's say there was a quota put out, Chinese farmers were allowed to produce till that quota at a particular price. If people produce more than that, that price, that amount of excess production would always be sold in the market at market price. So you had a dual track system. This ensured that while there was there was a retention of the planned system, the planned machinery, the planning commission, so to say, and the state control was there to some extent. But this allowed the market economy to come up and prosper. This is how, and this the most important impact of it was the farms were recognized as business entities now, which was not the case earlier. Abolition of rural communes. So you did not, no longer was the farmer at the mercy of a commune which dictated what to be produced at what price to be sold. The farmer was given freedom to sell it. sell his produce wherever she wanted, in one province of the in province A or province B. There was no restrictions placed. When it comes to deregulating agricultural products, agricultural product market, like I said, there was a dual track system. What did this result in? This now created a rise in the gross value added of agriculture, which is seen in the first graph. So up to a point of time, the effect was felt, and gross value added in agriculture went up. So this was one aspect of the planning, the market system in China. And coming to the uh, excuse me, yeah, coming to the industry, the industrial sector was excuse me, there's some issue on my end. All right. So when it comes to the industrial sector, she started delegating authority to the state-owned enterprises. So that means instead of privatization, that is a very important point to be noted when how China's privatization or market-oriented reforms were compared to India's. So we went for full-on privatization, which is good in one sense, of course, because state had too much burden in India because it was a democracy, it was not a state control or you know what China is. It's not a communist country. So you can have exceptions. So we went for full-on privatization, while China ensured that autonomy was given to the state-owned enterprises. So in a way, it was similar to what we did by creating Maharatnas, Mini Ratnas, and Navaratnas. And when it comes to a very important aspect of the industrial policy that China started, which we are also adopting now, we started special economic zones. It was first started in China. So when they started special economic zones, which is all about creating manufacturing hubs in various provinces. So what this is now being adopted in Uttar Pradesh. I think I'm given to understand that they started creating each district should produce one particular type of product and they would market it that way. So something similar, but then special economic zones were huge grants of land given particularly to manufacturers to set up their factories and start producing various types of goods. So you have the one example of this is Shenzhen. Shenzhen is in China's almost near Hong Kong, just close to Hong Kong, and you have Guangzhou and a lot of other provinces. So what China did is first it reformed its agriculture, opened up its rural agriculture markets, created market forces to allowed market forces there, and then shifted the post to industry. In industry, they realized that they had cheap labor. China always, in those times, you had relatively cheaper labor, compared to all the East Asian countries. So Japan produced a lot of goods, Korea produced a lot of goods, but then the cost of labor started going up. So China was the only country which had a relatively cheaper labor cost in Asia. So what it do, it took advantage of it. Deng Xiaoping started what is called as the open door policy. Open door policy was essentially creating what we call in India as ease of doing business. So he started ordering tax cuts, access to China's labor pool, and important is this joint venture between state-owned enterprises and Chinese firms were allowed to access partner with Western companies. So that's how you started seeing Apple, etc., being manufactured in China. And the policy here is very interesting. If you take a look at this, it shows that China's merger, it was all about 4-point strategy. So it ensured that there was a merger of state-owned enterprises. Small ones were made into bigger ones, while some of them were sold off because if they could not maintain it, was not as important a PSU as they deemed it to be. So it was a very small PSU, and at the provincial level, it was sold off, while leasing assets to stakeholders. That means it created a certain amount of, you know, I would say, allowed other companies to access their capital, access their machinery, and start producing. Because if they were loss making, then they would open up the shop and then they would ask those companies to start manufacturing there. This is a very interesting plan in that sense because we did not do that. We allowed complete privatization, and the private parties would then decide what to be produced there, what not to be produced there, which is also fine in one sense because Indian situation is very different from Chinese situation. A very important aspect of China's industrial growth and reform story is this: joint ventures between Chinese state-owned enterprises and American and Korean companies. So in that sense, what you have is a particular, this was a particular policy which was mm, transforming China in many ways, because now what you see in China and the way it's producing or creating manufacturing hubs is all about this policy. That's how you have Apple coming into China, Lenovo, etc. All the products, electronic manufacturing hub started in China this way because they ensured that there was a joint venture, and this allowed FDI to come into China. So this is an observation made in one of the uh, literature that I came across. The dual track system was the preeminent of all the transitional institutions. It allowed a planning systems continuation, but also allowed an unplanned economy to emerge. So this was in essence Chinese model. You did not completely do away with. They did not completely do away with the state-owned system, while they also ensured the market system be in place. So this is a very interesting contrast when you take up India's case because India's situation is such that firstly it's a democracy. You have also varying political, socio-economic factors. You have regional differences. You have regional, I would put it in this way, regional imbalances, because that's why you had the state of division of states in the south. You had Andhra and Telangana divided on economic basis, almost not arguing. So you have all these factors in India. In China, you had a dictatorship, I would say. So this is a set of graph which show how after transition China developed. The FDI also started increasing only after 1990. So at least 10 to 15 years was spent in creating the climate for Chinese businesses to compete with the Western companies and also allow them to be in joint ventures. This is a very interesting graph which shows that FDI actually took some time to be translated. In India, right after the liberalization, the FDI started going up. If you take a look at the graph available in any of the sources. So this is China's trade balance over the years. So it was all the while there was a continuous deficit for a few years, but after that they started having surplus. Why was this so? I'll come to that in a moment. This is a very important graph in one sense if you want to just understand how Chinese models work. In 1970s and 1980s, the trade share in the GDP was not much, around 6 to 7%. 10 to 20 years later, you find that it goes up to 64% in 2005 or so. That's why more than half of China's growth was coming because of the trade agreement, or in general foreign trade. So for a country which was ideologically closed in terms of economy and was not very, uh, you know, I would say not very ready for such a change. For such a country to become to have trade going more than 50% of the GDP is something very different, very remarkable. Because from 50% or more than that, so now if you take a figure, this is around 64% of the GDP is coming from trade. So trade is an important driver of China's growth. So trade, you would take it as a sum of exports and imports, where exports was much higher in China. So this is one aspect. So the new mechanism of using the West's experience, combining it with China's inherent hard working nature of the labor force, made sure that the decentralized manufacturing system expanded and enabled a sharp rise in employment. So employment went up in a big way in the reform period, though till then it was a certainty. If you take a look at this, around 1974 it was still around a certain level, but after that it went up, it doubled in the next 15 to 20 years, started rising, and after that it almost, if you compare the figure in 1974 and 2016, it has doubled up. So this is one point in terms of employment and how employment grew. A major factor, if one was the reform, one part of the reform was the trade went up to 60% of the GDP. The other engine. So one was a trade engine, the other was the savings engine. Why would I say so? Because savings engine went up. The savings engine, I would call it, because savings and investment are both linked. So you had a rise of employment, you had a rise in the wage rate going up. So you saw the industries went up, and after the industrial hub was created, it ensured that the wages started going up. There was a better standard of living for China's population, and this improved the per capita income, as we saw earlier. What did this result in? The Chinese, like in India, in all other Asian countries, started having a high share of savings. This is a feature in a lot of Asian countries and East Asian countries, that savings are having a quite a significant level as a percentage of GDP. If you take the rate of savings, it's quite high, and China's has the highest. India comes second because India is around 30% to 34%. It has come down from 36. But China has kept on going up, but only in the recent times it has slightly dipped. So savings was a key factor because they did not have to depend so much on FDI. They had enough saving created in their country, which helped them invest adequately in infrastructure projects. So this was one driver apart from trade. If you take a look at this graph, it shows that if you take a look at this, so you have a positive correlation between the savings rate and rate of investment in China, and that is evident also in the graph seen. There is almost a similar trend being exhibited by both the savings and investment. So, if you take a look at it, if trade went up to more than 50%, rate of savings went up to 50% as well. So, roughly half of your economy is being funded, I would say, or driven by savings, and this translated into investment as well in public infrastructure. So this is how public infrastructure projects and public infrastructure planning happened in China, and that's how they're able to build so much of metro rail and airports and seaports like we see in Hong Kong, and the rail network that they created. All of this comes from a high increased share of public investment. How has that happened? Because of a high rate of savings. India had almost 36% of savings. The rate of savings was almost 36%, and the rate of investment was almost 30 plus, almost 35%, almost roughly the same, around 2008 or so. But after that, it started declining because there was no incentive. Even the incentive to save started coming down. So that is one aspect. The third aspect of China's growth is seen in this difference. So this is the sectoral share in GDP and how it changed over the years. You take agriculture, it was predominantly it was having rather high share, and after that you start seeing it coming down after the reforms were started. So what happened in effect was your reform in agriculture improved its market system and enabled people to shift from rural industries to urban sector and industrial sector in a big way. So that's why you have a higher share of industry. So from being a predominantly agrarian society, it went into industrial society, and from industrial society, it went to become a services-oriented economy, which is also the case in India. But the contrast lies in this: China went reformed its agriculture and then went to industry. We did not reform our agriculture. We did not create any incentive to export our agriculture in a big way. There's still we are only having a limited scope in exports even today. We are not having that kind of a production, incentive for exporting agricultural products. Despite our a lot of our products becoming being sold at a very cheap rate, in world market. So services also is now becoming a very important player in China's GDP, just like ours. Even ours is around 60% coming. Our GDP is 60% services, and the rest of the remaining is agriculture, which is again very low, and manufacturing. We have to increase our share of manufacturing, and that will be only possible if you adopt a policy which is ensuring that the MSMEs grow up in number and we don't have more big industries. You have to have small scale industries in a big way, not big industries in every small pocket. This is again the occupational share or occupational structure, so to say. That is again occupied by services. Second comes the industrial sector, and the third is the agricultural sector. So you have a consistent decline in the share of agriculture in employment and a rise in the services sector's share in employment. So what is the conclusion that we can take from Chinese model? The conclusion you can isn't not very much, but you have a certain amount of you can take it up. So that is what is the Chinese model? It was investment in joint ventures with American companies, trade deficit with East Asian nations. So China was essentially a middleman. So it took raw material, it purchased raw materials from East Asian countries, used those products to manufacture for which goods for which the West demand was the maximum. So that was it was like a China was the factory where raw materials came and went out as finished products. So this enabled China to export in a big way and export quality manufactured goods. So that's how they developed a hard industrial base using the cheap labor cost. So this is a very important distinction again. So with has so how if you compare that with Indian transition in the 90s, Indian transition relatively stopped in the mid 90s, but the market forces went on to create a lot of upheavals in the economic system. That's how you have the IT sector growing. But what about the manufacturing sector? The MSMB provides you nearly 30% of the gross value added. So we have to focus on MSMEs at least now to ensure that there is adequate employment created. And it's not just that the government has a direct role in that, but direct role cannot. I mean, in 21st century, you cannot expect a government to have a direct say in ordering that this should be produced, this industry should be encouraged. Rather, you leave it to the market forces. So for that, you need to create an environment wherein MSMEs are able to borrow it cheaply and adequate employment is created, and also the profits are having a backup. So you cannot allow them to be, put in dire straits just because they don't have enough capital, enough amount to pay back their loans. And an important aspect from a lesson, I would say, from China has to be the focus on physical infrastructure. You have the roads, highways, shipping product, ports, railways, etc. So if you compare the way you have, of course, you are having good roads in India, but if you compare that with China, we have a very different approach. We don't. It's all you know. There's partly the state, partly the central government, partly the local government. So you have three players in the infrastructure uh, sector. You also have the private parties coming in. So you have to ensure that there is adequate physical infrastructure built in so that it's easy for firms to start coming into your country and start their supply chain. The supply chain becoming robust is only an indicator that you have a very good infrastructure. That is how China developed. If there's any lesson, it's not the Chinese model of growth that you can take, but their focus on physical infrastructure and how it came about to high rate of savings. This is what you can learn from China. And the last question I leave out with is, can the model be replicated? No, because over the last couple of years, China's terms of trade has been declining sharply, while its export has gone up. So this is what Jagdish Bhagwati, as early as 60s, 1950s, 60s, called it as emericizing growth. That means after you start exporting more and you become overexposed to the international export market, international trade, your terms of trade start declining after a point. So this, in essence, is what is happening in China now. So this is all about it, and this is a set of the references I use for that. So hope you found it interesting. And I know it was a long lecture. I don't really, there were a lot of technicalities involved in this. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and do reach out to me on my Twitter handle at Powantima45, and also subscribe to my channel, and also subscribe to our podcast, CD Bar. So don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all again next time. Till then, take care of yourself and sayonara.